Hi, we're back to 11.1 lecture video B, and we are going to be solving example number 3 using the square root property in an application. An expert marksman can hold a silver dollar at forehead level, drop it, draw his gun, and shoot the coin as it passes waist level. If the coin falls about 4 feet, use the formula D equals 16t squared to find the time that elapses between dropping of the coin and the shot. So basically, you guys, all we're doing is we're using D equals 16t squared. The distance, remember, is 4 equals 16t squared. Now, since we're solving this using the square root property, remember, you got to get t squared by itself. Now, in order to get t squared by itself, we are going to divide both sides by 16. So we end up with t squared equals, now if you can reduce the fraction, go ahead and reduce the fraction. That gives me 1 over 4. 4 goes into 4 once, 4 goes into 16 4 times. Now, our goal is to get t squared by itself. So that means I need to square root both sides of the equation. Now I'm going to go over here and rewrite this a little bit. That leaves me with t equals, don't forget it's going to be plus or minus the square root of 1 over the square root of 4. Remember, the square root of 1/4 is exactly the same thing as the square root of 1 over the square root of 4, because whatever's under the radicals are being either multiplied together or divided by each other, depending on what the problem actually says. This is a division problem. I personally like making the square root on top and the square root on the bottom so that you can see it a little bit clearer and you can simplify it easier. First of all, the square root of 1 is 1. The square root of 4 is 2. So you guys have two answers. You have t is 1/2 and t is negative 1/2. Now time is always positive, so it should be d is 1/2. So a half a second. So it should take a half a second for it to pass by the waist level. All right, let's move on to the next question. We want to get through these. This time, you guys, these problems are wonderful. They're still square roots or squares, and you're just trying to solve and get rid of the square. Now, whenever you have a square, you just square root it. So we're going to solve this quadratic equation, and the way we're going to do this is, in general, if you were to factor this, I would actually have to multiply p minus 4 times p minus 4, get some big giant problem, move the 3 over, and solve it by factoring. But we don't want to do that. We want to use square roots to help us. Now, if you notice, this p minus 4 is inside of a parentheses. So that means it's already by itself. There is nothing in front of it and there's nothing behind it. So when I say that, this is what I mean. I have p minus 4 squared equals 3. If you notice, there is only a 1 here, and there's nothing behind the quantity of p minus 4 squared. So the p minus 4 squared is completely alone, just like when we had x squared by itself. So as long as there's not a number in front of this and there's not a number behind it, we can use the square root formula or the square root property to get that solved for the quadratic equation. Sorry. All right, so what I want to do is I want to get rid of the square. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to square root this side and I'm going to square root this side, because whatever you do to one side, you must do to the other. Now, whatever is being squared comes out of that radical. So if you notice p minus 4 squared, p minus 4 is being squared. So when you square root it, whatever is inside that parenthesis, it comes out. So you end up with p minus 4 equals, now here's where it's tricky. You can't forget the plus or minus. And you guys, we can't square root 3. It's not possible. Now, in the end, we're solving for p, so you need to get p by itself. So I'm going to move the 4 over. I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So I'm left with p equals. Now, this 4 and this plus or minus square roots of 3, they are different terms. You cannot combine them. So I'm going to write it out as 4 plus or minus the square root of 3. And you're finished. That's your answer. Now, on the actual homework, your homework might look like this. You have two answers. You have a 4 plus a square root of 3 or a 4 minus square root of 3. So just to let you know, they mean the same thing. All right, let's do the next problem. All right, same thing. We have the quantity of 4m plus 2 squared. Now, when I have this problem, I end up with 4m plus 2 squared equals 64. Remember, I have nothing in front of it and I have nothing behind it. So that means it is isolated. So my goal is to get rid of the square. So I'm going to square root this side and I'm going to square root this side. This leaves me with 4m plus 2 equals plus or minus. Now the square root of 64 is 8. My goal is to solve for m. So that means I've got to get 4m by itself. So I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. That gives me 4m equals, now the negative 2 and the plus or minus 8 at this moment. I can't do anything with it at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to write it out. I like to see it. I'm a visual learner, so it just makes it easier. So negative 2 plus or minus, oops, let me do something real fast. Plus or minus 8. Now, because I know I can combine these two terms or these two numbers together, I'm going to wait before I actually divide this. So the way I'm going to write this out is 4m equals negative 2 plus 8, or 4m equals negative 2 minus 8. If you notice, I wrote it out twice because I have a plus 8 and a negative 8. So I wrote, before I actually divide by 4, I want to clean up that side of the equation. So I get 4m equals negative 2 plus 8 is 6. Now I'm going to divide by 4. Whatever you do to one side, you must do to the other. And I'm left with m equals 6 over 4. Now I notice that they both share a 2. So my actual answer is 3/2. Or I'm going to do the same thing over here. I get 4m equals negative 10, because negative 2 plus a negative 8 is a negative 10. I'm going to divide both sides by 4. And I'm going to get m equals negative 10/4. Now, they both share a 2, so your actual answer is a negative 5/2. 2 goes into negative 10, negative 5 times. 2 goes into 4 twice. So those would be your two answers. Your two answers would be 3/2 or negative 5/2. All right, let's go to the next one. Same thing here. My goal is to get x, or the 5m plus 1 by itself. So I'm going to rewrite it real quick. Now I need to get rid of the square. So I'm going to square root this side and I'm going to square root this side. So I'm left with 5m plus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 7. Don't forget the plus or minus square root of 7. My goal is to get 5m by itself, so I'm going to get rid of the 1 by subtracting it. And now I'm left with a negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 7. Now in this case, I can't combine the negative 1 and the square root of 7. So I'm just going to leave it the way it looks. I don't have to do anything special. So this time I'm going to divide everything by 5. Oops. I'm going to divide everything by 5. I'm trying to make this red. There it goes. And I'm going to divide this by 5. So I'm left with m equals negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 7 all over 5. And that would be my answer. Now, if we were taking a pen and pencil paper test, that would be your answer. However, the answers on the actual quiz or homework that you guys are taking, this is how it's probably represented. And I just want you guys to be aware of it. Okay, so that would be the correct answer. Let's move on to number 6. Number 6, sorry, this is just still example 5. It's just example 5C. Now this one has a little bit more work. There is a number in front of the writing, so sorry. So we have 4 times the quantity of 2m plus 5 squared equals 16. You guys, you cannot square root this at the moment because the parenthesis that is being squared is not alone. There's actually a number in front of it. You've got to get rid of that before you actually square root it. So I'm going to divide both sides by 4. It's going to leave me with 2m plus 5 squared equals 16 divided by 4 is 4. Now, the parenthesis that is being squared is alone, meaning there's nothing in front of it and there's nothing right behind it. So what you're going to do is you're going to square root both sides. So I'm going to square root this side and I'm going to square root this side. Okay? So now whatever's inside the parenthesis comes out because this square root gets rid of that square, remember. Equals. Now you cannot forget it's plus or minus. Now the square root of 4 is 2. So now what you're left with is you got to get 2m by itself. So in order to get 2m by itself, you're going to minus 5 from both sides. Now, I'm going to write it over here. So you're left with 2m equals negative 5 plus or minus 2. Now, once again, because I can actually combine these, I'm going to write this out twice. I'm going to write it out as 2m equals negative 5 plus 2, or 2m equals negative 5 minus 2. And the reason why you want to do that is you want to combine what you can first before you start dividing any sides. So on this side, I'm left with 2m equals negative 5 plus 2 is negative 3. Now my goal is to get m by itself, so now I would divide by 2. And m is equal to negative 3/2. Or, now let's do the other side. On the other side, I'm left with 2m equals negative 5 plus a negative 2 is a negative 7. I'm going to divide both sides of them by 2 because it's 2m. And my answer is going to be m equals negative 7/2. And those would be your 2 solutions. Alrighty, let's see what else we have. All right, now you guys, what happens if what's under the radical is going to be negative? Remember lesson 1 when we had imaginary numbers? Well, this is when we're going to come up with imaginary numbers. Now remember, the x squared is by itself. Your goal is to get, to solve for x. That's all it is. There's nothing in front of the x squared. There's nothing right behind the x squared. So the x squared is completely isolated. Now, because the x squared is completely isolated, we can go ahead and square root both sides. We are square rooting both sides because we want to get rid of the square. So whatever you do to one side, you must do to the other side. So we end up with x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 17. Now remember, don't forget the plus or minus, because with a quadratic equation, you should have 2 answers. All right, now in lesson 1, we had things that look like this. Whenever you have a negative under a radical, or 4.1, whenever we did square roots, way back in first semester, or I can't remember, chapter 5 or chapter 6 or one of those chapters. We did radicals. And so on this one, in order to get rid of the negative under the radical, it's going to be a negative 1 times the square root of 17. Remember, whatever's under the radicals are multiplied together. So the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 17 is the square root of negative 17. Now, we all know from before, and if you forgot, I'm just going to write it out right here. Remember, the square root of negative 1 is equal to I. And then remember, I squared is equal to -1. That's just something that we learned back when we were doing imaginary numbers. So the square root of -1 is I, and you cannot square root 17, like it's not possible. So my actual answer is going to be plus or minus I square roots of 17. There is my answer. Again, because of your guys' homework, it might look like this. I square roots of 17, negative I square roots of 17. It just depends on how your answer is presented, okay? Let's do another one. Now on this one, if you notice, I don't have a number in front of this. I don't have a number in the back of the the x plus 5 squared. My goal is to get the x plus 5 squared, and we got to get rid of the square. I'm trying to think and write at the same time. All right, so what we're going to do right now is this. Whoops, I guess not that. Oops. There you go. I was trying to get rid of that, but it's okay. I'll just leave it there. All right, so I need to go ahead and get the square taken away. And by doing that, we square root both sides. So I square root both sides, and I get x plus 5 equals plus or minus. Before you do anything, always remember the plus and minus. Now, I'm going to do some little bit of math over here. I have the square root of 100 times the square root of -1. I know that the square root of 100 is 10, and I know that the square root of -1 is I. So this is going to be 10I. Now, I need to find out what x is, so I need to get rid of the 5. So I'm going to minus 5 from both sides. And I'm left with x equals -5 plus or minus 10I. You cannot simplify those. You cannot like combine anything because one's an imaginary part, one's a real part. They're not the same. That does create a complex number though. So this is your answer. Now remember on your homework might be written like this: -5 plus 10I or -5 minus 10I. So just remember your homework is written, or your ABC, however it is, your answers are given. It could be looking like that. All right. And we finished it. All right. I think we did it in like less than 15 minutes. Okay, so that's it for that one. And just got to remember how to turn this off. Don't change. Go here and click on that button.